our lives are at further risk.
There's a common narrative that what we see in present-day New Orleans is the result of our own past actions or inaction.
When you gotta go to the grocery store with your gun on your pocket, that's a war zone.
History and data connects our present-day problems to past policy.
15 an hour.
Policies designed to limit or really even eliminate opportunities in minority communities.
When will this stop?
Policies whose legacies have become so institutionalized that while the physical line has been erased, the mental and social line remains.
If you really want to address crime, you got to think about the nucleus of the problem.
So, could a line drawn generations ago result in the poverty, crime, lack of education, and many other issues some New Orleanians face today?
And we're doing the same old crazy, insane things over and over and over again.
I'd never crave a po' boy because I don't eat bread like that.
Shoot. I'm going to give me a hot sausage with cheese. Oh, this is cool. Look at this place.
Right.
That's my kind of place, man. Shoot. These are all black books, too.
Dr. Eric Johnson has worked in urban development and real estate development in cities across America, but he's a native New Orleanian.
Alumnus of Walter Cohen Senior High School. Yeah, you know how New Orleans is.
Right.
First question is, where you go to school, you know? I moved a lot when I was a child growing up, but predominantly grew up in uptown New Orleans. That was really sort of the origins of my life experience uptown New Orleans.
This, especially kind of this little
Our
area.
origin story can shape who we become. Well, the same can be said for New Orleans' origin story, a line Dr. Johnson says traces back to the early wealthy settlers who purchased the highland in New Orleans.
Before the Civil War, African Americans and whites in the city, they were sort of mixing in a little socially and physically and economically.
New Orleans was rather unique in this sense, thanks to the large population of free people of color living amongst whites and the enslaved.
And right after the Civil War, we start to see a city that becomes moving towards a greater segregated city. Right after Reconstruction, when African Americans were making progress, here comes Jim Crow. Let's knock it out of the box. It takes away that sort of progress.
The decision in the Plessy v. Ferguson case was polarizing. Jim Crow's separate but equal laws went into effect, intensifying hostility and division.
Heading into the early part of the 20th century, there is this sort of movement that's starting to happen to say, wait a minute, we need to start to separate ourselves from African Americans.
Part of that movement was the enactment of racial zoning laws, meaning neighborhoods could explicitly say only black people or white people could live in them. When the Supreme Court deemed those unconstitutional in 1917, the city of New Orleans enacted its own racial zoning laws in 1924, also deemed unconstitutional.
Right after the Supreme Court said that we couldn't create neighborhoods based on race, we developed another tool that accomplished the same result, and that is single-family zoning.
Stacy Scheck-Snyder is a professor of law at Tulane University.
It created single-family zones for whites only, and the only use that was allowed in the neighborhood was a single-family home. So any other uses, apartments, industrial uses, commercial uses, things that were hazardous, all the other uses that were restricted and kept out of single-family zones were allowed in black neighborhoods, and that sort of created the scaffolding for redlining.
Great Depression. The idea was, let's jumpstart the construction industry through home ownership. Here comes the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, that now creates these maps that starts to divide cities. New Orleans is no different.
Banks came in and they saw white neighborhoods were created to be the most desirable neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods were overcrowded, and they were side by side with all kinds of hazardous uses. And so, of course, it was easy for banks to say, well, we're only going to invest in single-family neighborhoods. Those are the neighborhoods that are going to get the green designation on the redlining map. And black neighborhoods that were set up as overcrowded and hazardous places were, of course, given the red designation on the map.
The blue color represented neighborhoods still considered desirable, while the yellow indicated a neighborhood was definitely declining.
It helped institutionalize a system where if you were black, you were not able to get a loan yourself. But neighborhoods where blacks lived were also not deemed acceptable for investment. And so even whites who lived in black neighborhoods were not able to get loans.
These maps started to define the boundaries.
These communities were, in a sense, designated for failure through tactics of exclusion now supported by the federal government.
You started to see African Americans become more contained in areas, let's say, like a central city.
4 people were shot and a 5th was killed in a shooting in Central City.
Wednesday in Central City, a 19-year-old was in a car when someone started shooting.
They cut all the programs out for our black children.
The origins of Central City go back to the 1800s when it was mostly occupied by immigrants like the Irish, Germans, and Italians, and soon African Americans. The Data Research Center described the area as a large, mosquito-infested and swampy area that was below sea level. The homes are mostly clustered tightly together and done shotgun style, with a large percent of renters.
Essentially, on the red line map, all of this would be red line,
Yes.
including where we are actually headed towards. And can you tell us, like, if we're walking a physical line here, where would the line stop?
That line, you cross St. Charles Avenue on the other side, you start to get more into the green category. The streetcar line is a natural boundary, right? That begins to create sort of a different feel and some could call it a barricade to the other side. Natural barricades, some unnatural barricades creates a sort of distinction and separation.
A separation that is only minutes, if not seconds apart.
If you're going to contain people, they don't have access to the growth of the economy, mobility where economic opportunities are, and this whole thing is moving generation after generation.
Dr. Johnson says concentrated poverty and segregation not only limits social and economic opportunity, but it's the impetus of the racial wealth gap in New Orleans.
The only way you get wealth in this country, if you are either low income or middle, is through home ownership, the equity built there. But imagine you don't have the ability to own a home or purchase, or if you did buy a house, you have interest rates that are so high because the federal government will not insure you to get a loan through the bank.
You pair that with a lack of investment, low-wage jobs, and substandard education, your racial zone and red line zone becomes a disaster zone, leaving a lot of our responses to modern-day issues superficial.
Where is the facility? We went from integration to gentrification.
This is not justice, because no one can achieve justice under an unjust system that prioritizes profit over people.
The housing piece and the ability to create wealth to pass on to each generation is the glue that has created the situation we're in.